Arcade Heroes.
Get ready!
Greetings, happy Mario Day to everybody out there. This is Adam with ArcadeHeroes.com, and this video I'm going to take a look at the various arcade games that star Mario, starting with Donkey Kong by Nintendo, released in 1981, developed by Shigeru Miyamoto, and it really is the game that saved Nintendo because the previous stuff they had done, particularly a game called Radar Scope, bombed so hard that they were kind of on their last legs at that point. And this game right here was so revolutionary and so good that it saved the company's bacon. But I'm going to take a look at that. Of course, yes, I know that in this it's Jumpman, not technically Mario, but that really is where the character started. So I'm going to go through that and the various other coin-operated video arcade games that star Mario or his brother Luigi over the years, and so let's jump into that. OG Mario game, Donkey Kong, which was released in 1981 by Nintendo, and this did have Mario as Jumpman, but it really is Mario. We just say he had a career change from carpenter in Donkey Kong to later being a plumber, and then he's been a plumber ever since, even though he doesn't necessarily use carpentry or plumbing skills in all of the games, but that's fine. But of course in Donkey Kong, it's significant in the history of video games and arcades just because of how it presented platforming. It wasn't technically the first game where you're controlling a character running along platforms and dealing with ladders. There was Space Panic by Universal that did that first, although, if I recall correctly, Space Panic didn't have a jumping feature, and that's something innovative that Donkey Kong brought to the table. Of course, it was also one of those early games in the 80s to have you saving the damsel in distress, who in this case was Pauline, not Peach. Peach wouldn't come along until Super Mario Brothers. But at least in Donkey Kong, you are doing everything you can to avoid getting killed from various obstacles, whether they're barrels that Donkey Kong is throwing at you, or flames, or rivets, or whatever else that it is, and exploring different levels as you get along. Now, personally, I'm not really good at Donkey Kong, and there's a whole documentary on people who are great at it, and others have tried to take the crown to become the king of Kong, and it's just one of those games that's easy to learn but difficult to master, and it's kept interest for a long time. Now, of course, the Donkey Kong series itself has veered off into very different avenues over the years, such as with Donkey Kong Country and all those other Donkey Kong games, but so has Mario. Now, in 1982, Nintendo followed up with Donkey Kong Jr., which, interestingly enough, is one of the few, if not the only game that puts Mario into the role of a villain, as he captures Donkey Kong as revenge for what he did to Pauline. Now, you don't control Mario in this one, but he is there, and he's the one that's sending all the little chomper guys after you when you're controlling Donkey Kong Jr. to try and rescue Dad. Now, there was Donkey Kong 3, but it does not star Mario, so we won't really bring that one up here. Now, the first time that Luigi would appear in an arcade game is in Mario Brothers, that was released in 1983. And now it really was just a palette swap, and even on the game's flyer, they look pretty much the same as brothers, like they're twins, pretty much. But it would be with the Super Mario Brothers TV show that would come along a few years later that established Luigi as the taller, skinnier one, and Mario as the fatter one, fatter, shorter one. But Mario Brothers, before they were Super, this is where Mario changed roles into a plumber from a carpenter. He was down in the sewers, fighting against shell creepers, fighter flies, and sidesteppers. This one did also have the POW feature where you'd jump into that and it would knock anything that was on a surface upside down or hurt it a little bit, so you could knock them over later as you would get into further levels. Like the whole weird thing about this, if you've never played it, is you have to hit enemies from below, and some enemies would turn upside down after one hit, and then you have to go and touch them to knock them down into the sewage water. But there were other enemies like the crabs where you had to hit them twice to get them to turn upside down before you could do that. But overall, this one established or planted the seeds for what would come later. But in arcades, Super Mario Bros. Wasn't next. It was actually Versus Wrecking Crew in 1984. Now, Nintendo's Versus hardware brought the NES to US arcades before you could buy the console in stores. And as a result, it allowed Nintendo to sell and promote many Famicom or NES converted titles by using arcades as essentially a stage or a prop, which would eventually cover Super Mario Brothers so we'll talk about in a moment. But Mario and Luigi were still in the spotlight of Versus Wrecking Crew, as they were the characters, as you see with this slightly odd flyer there. But you were smashing down columns in a building and serving as a wrecking crew, as opposed to just taking out enemies as people would come to know them in Super Mario Brothers, which did come out on the PlayChoice 10 hardware, which was similar to the Versus hardware, but it was a bit more like a prop to promote the NES, and it was successful as it allowed you to install up to 10 games into the machine. These were basically just NES ports. There would be, or at least with the Versus style, those games would be modified and, generally speaking, harder than the PlayChoice versions. The PlayChoice versions were pretty much the NES versions with a timer. I think there might be some minute differences between them, but I think, if I'm recalling correctly, the Versus ones had most of the differences on them. But you could get Super Mario Brothers on the PlayChoice 10 for super cheap. I think, if I recall correctly, it was somewhere around $300-400 to get one of the upgrade chips or cartridges to do that. No, you couldn't just plug an NES cartridge right into it and call it a day. It did have to be specially programmed, but I believe it doesn't take a whole lot of work to switch them over. But in 1986 is when we got Versus Super Mario Brothers for the Versus hardware, and again, this one is a more difficult variation of Super Mario Brothers, and you could think of it as a dedicated version of the game in arcades. It came with its own marquee and cabinet, and that is one that either way, it's possible that if you played Super Mario Brothers in the arcade, you were either playing the Versus version or you're playing the PlayChoice version. But it was there, and some classic arcades out there have included that as well. Now, speaking of PlayChoice, in 1988, both Super Mario Brothers 2 and 3 did find their way to arcades through the PlayChoice hardware versions. Not super common, but hey, I remember as a kid the extreme hype that was around Super Mario Bros. 3, including with the Wizard movie. That was basically just a giant commercial for 3, and that was a great marketing campaign by Nintendo to get people on board with both of those games. But of course, Super Mario Bros. 3 was liked a bit more than 2 was. And I'm not just saying that from what people's impressions are now. I remember that being back in the day. A lot of us weren't entirely pleased with 2 because it was just such a departure from the first one. And then 3 kind of felt like it was bringing it back to where it should have been, in our opinion, at the time. Next up was Dr. Mario and Versus Dr. Mario. Dr. Mario would be on the PlayChoice 10, and then, of course, Versus Dr. Mario on the Nintendo Versus hardware. Both of these came out in 1990, so this was well and pretty much almost the end of the NES life, because the SNES would be coming out a year later. but this still provided a way for Mario to find his way into arcades, and there are people who've dedicated machines that have the Dr. Mario marquee and everything that you could play there. And then the very last appearance of Mario on the Play Choice hardware came in 1991 with Mario's Open Golf, and it just, again, was a conversion of that, and that's one that I would imagine would play better with a trackball than with a joystick and button controls, but the joystick button controls would at least keep it easy to convert over, and like the NES version. Now, in 1991, speaking of the SNES, Nintendo did attempt to do something like the Play Choice 10 with their Nintendo Super System, but it just never caught on like the Play Choice or the Versus did. And it only, if I'm recalling correctly, only came out with 4 games, but one of those was actually the Super Mario World, which was the pack-in title for the SNES. And so again, this was almost more of a kiosk that you had to put coins into, so you can kind of play before you buy on the SNES. But again, it just didn't do super well, in part because of the big goofy SNES controllers, which extremely unusual for an arcade, but these did not hold up well under the abuse that arcades would. And I mean, just much larger D-pad and buttons and such, but I think they should have just done some proper arcade controls that would have held up better, and then perhaps it might have done better numbers compared to what it actually did. Now, there is a listing for Super Mario All-Stars for the Nintendo Super System that I've seen out there. However, I don't have any evidence that that was actually released for it. It's probably just advertised, but Nintendo gave up on it. And also, that was the last time where Nintendo themselves would produce an arcade machine. Everything else that I'm going to talk about after this, it would be stuff that other companies built and licensed from Nintendo, but there still was more to see from Mario himself, such as with Super Mario Bros. Pinball by Gottlieb that came out in 1992. I've played this one as well as the other one that Gottlieb produced that year, Super Mario Bros. Mushroom World, and both of them were a little bit odd, but also significant. The first one, just the Super Mario Bros. Pinball, was actually the first time that Gottlieb had used a dot matrix display, which would be known as a DMD display, and the pinball industry was using monochromatic DMD displays all the way up to 2016. It took them a very long time to get with the times there. But also, Super Mario Bros. Pinball is notable for being the first time when now retired Mario voice actor Charles Martinet would voice Mario. He wasn't given credit for the role in the game itself at the time, but if you have ever come across this machine and played it and it's like, hey, that sounds like the Mario voice that I've come to know over the years, that's because it is that voice actor. But Mushroom World, just to note that it was designed more for kids and to be played as a redemption machine. Now, it could be played without the tickets, but the dimensions on it were also a little bit strange, and but it's a fun game. I've played, I think it was both of these at the Pinball Hall of Fame in Las Vegas. My son, I think, had a little bit more fun with the Mushroom World one, if I'm recalling correctly, and he was able to get a grand champion high score on that. But yeah, overall, not the most common games to find out there, and I'm surprised that there hasn't been another newer Super Mario Brothers, maybe like based on the movie, that would be out there. But perhaps one of these days, probably the license cost would be the reason why these are so expensive. But yeah, you never know. We never say never as far as whether or not this will show up again. Next up in 1993 was Mario Undukai by Bam Presto. It's a Japan-only card vending game, and there is footage out there on YouTube as to how it worked. Used a foot pad 5 years before DDR did, but it might have actually inspired the controls used in Mario and Sonic Olympics Arcade that I'll discuss in a few moments. Then we had a very long gap because Nintendo wasn't producing arcade machines anymore, and nobody was really interested in licensing it out. It just didn't find Mario and any new things until 2005 when Namco would release Mario Kart Arcade GP. Now, of course, this has been released in 3 flavors. You have GP, GP2, and then GPDX. GPDX having been launched in 2013. And amazingly enough, that the most recent one, GPDX, is still being manufactured, as I mentioned this now, in 2025. It's not the longest manufactured game in arcade history. That might still go to, I think it's Aliens Extermination by Global VR. However, as time goes on, if they keep manufacturing it, I think that it will take the cake of that. But either way, the Mario Kart Arcade games have been notable out there, really good sellers, particularly with GPDX. And I know they've sold thousands of those machines in particular. But they are all exclusive to arcades. Of course, that means everybody's always asking for the tracks to be released to the home versions. But these did things beyond just what Mario Kart on consoles would do. It would have like live commentary, a lot of unique items that you could use. Some characters that you wouldn't always find on the home version, such as Pac-Man. I think Miss Pac-Man was in one of them. And there was also a NamCam avatar system that would use a camera to capture your face, and then you could use overlays from different Mario characters. And then, of course, in Japan, GPDX has had a lot more features added to it than what we've gotten in North America because it is connected to the internet, and they're able to offer new content to that. They had initially promised a lot of new content to come to the US side, but they just eventually gave up on that, unfortunately. But another notable thing about the very first 2 Mario Kart GP games is they were released on Sega's Triforce hardware, which is really just a modified GameCube console. GPDX was using one of Namco's PC modifications to that. But again, all 3 of those games have tracks that you're not really finding out there on other consoles or on any of the consoles and such. And so if you come across it out there, you can enjoy it, and let me know in the comments below if you have or which version of the Mario Kart arcade games are your favorite. And then in 2016, Sega and Nintendo, already having joined up to do Mario and Sonic at the Rio 2016 Olympic Games, released an arcade version of that. And of course, used to be way back that Sega and Nintendo were rivals, but they kissed and made up, and so now they're friendly and doing things like this game. There's actually been 2 releases of the Olympic Games. So you had the 2016 one based in Rio, then you had the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games, which was released in 2020. Of course, not a great year to be releasing any games like that, so I don't know how common it is to find out there. The Rio version did have some interesting controls as far as these giant oversized joysticks as well as a foot pad. However, most arcades that ran them out there, particularly the technicians, absolutely hated this because those joysticks broke all the time just because people would be violently smashing them and they just wouldn't last. And so when it came to the 2020 Olympic Games, they simplified the control scheme using giant push buttons. They still had the foot pad as that could hold up, but it was just, again, because it was released in 2020, I don't think it was very successful. But you could buy a conversion kit to switch over from 2016 to 2020 if you really wanted to. Now, those were technically the last times that Mario did appear in the arcade, and so it's been a few years and we haven't had anything else, but there's a couple of honorable mentions that I'll throw out there, such as Mario Roulette by Konami in 1991. And it's essentially a gambling game, and so that's why you're not really going to find it in an arcade. There's also Luigi's Mansion Arcade by Sega and Capcom and Nintendo in 2015, which took I believe it was the 3DS version of Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon, and heavily modified that for arcade play. I've had a Luigi's Mansion arcade for 5 years. It does okay. It doesn't do as well as some of the other light gun games because it is a bit more difficult to play than, say, something like Walking Dead or House of the Dead. Or Jurassic Park or anything like that, is you have to suck in the ghosts and move your controller around, and there's 2 types of control schemes and such, but, you know, it's Luigi. Close enough. He is a Super Mario brother, or Super Mario's brother, and he's still Super Luigi. I guess it's too bad they didn't throw in, for the second player, Mario to help you out. Instead, they throw in something that's almost like Waluigi, but not. A purple Luigi. And then there was Mario Party Challenge World, which was never actually released. I got footage of this. I played it at IAPA 2017. A different version from the version that I showed at IAPA 2017 was tested out there, and you can still find it at a location or 2 in the States. But again, since Raw Thrills never released it, just good luck if you can find it. But it used projection mapping on uneven surfaces. But I guess the problem was because it was adapted from what's called a metal game in Japan, which is very borderline gambling and not so skill-based, that Raw Thrills just didn't figure out a way to make it work here in the States, since that would have severely limited how many locations it could go into, even if it was just a ticket redemption game, but just not skill-based. Now, the last time that we saw anything Mario-related in arcades was with the super rare Mario Kart VR by Bandai Namco in 2017. And this had showed up at a couple of select VR Zone portals that were run by Bandai Namco at the time, from 2017 until I think 2021. I was quite surprised that this never got really pushed by Bandai Namco, and I think it's just because they became sour on VR. At least the Bandai Namco Amusements side did. They did try out a couple of other VR things, and they were hinting that Mario Kart VR might come with those, but ultimately they just didn't see the worth of it. But from all the reviews of people that played Mario Kart VR, it sounded like it was really well done. And so amongst VR games, it probably would have stood out there along the lines of something like a Beat Saber, but I've never played it myself. If you have, let us know what you thought about that in the comments below. But that overall covers our Mario Kart, or Mario Kart, Super Mario in the arcade. What do you think he might show up in next? Something from Sega, perhaps, or something from Raw Thrills, who knows? Which of these many games that I've mentioned is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video.